The fluorescent lights in Coldwater State Penitentiary's death row flickered with their usual arrhythmic pulse, casting the concrete corridor in alternating shades of sickly yellow and deep shadow. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, and the air carried that particular prison smell. Industrial cleaner failing to mask decades of human desperation, sweat, and something darker that had seeped into the very walls. Daniel Reeves sat on the edge of his steel bunk in cell 14, his posture perfectly straight despite 3 years of confinement. At 42 years old, he maintained a physique that defied the sedentary nature of death row, lean muscle visible beneath the orange jumpsuit, movements economical and precise. His hair, cropped close to his skull, showed streaks of premature gray at the temples. But it was his eyes that unsettled the guards who'd worked the block long enough to notice such things. Pale blue, utterly calm, and watching everything with an intensity that suggested he was constantly calculating distances, angles, vulnerabilities. 3 years, 1,095 days since the trial that had taken less than 2 weeks to convict him of 4 counts of first-degree murder. Daniel had sat through the proceedings in absolute silence, declining to testify in his own defense, ignoring his court-appointed attorney's increasingly desperate attempts to construct some narrative of innocence or temporary insanity. The prosecutor had painted him as a cold-blooded killer who'd executed 4 men in a warehouse in South Philadelphia with professional precision. 2 shots each, center mass and head, the kind of shooting that spoke to training and experience. Daniel hadn't denied any of it. He'd simply stared at the jury with those unsettling blue eyes and remained silent as they deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge had sentenced him to death, and Daniel had nodded once, as if confirming an expected outcome before being led away. Now he maintained a routine that the guards found equally unsettling in its discipline: wake at 6:30 a.m. exactly, without need for the morning buzzer. Physical training in his cell, push-ups, pull-ups on the bars, isometric exercises that required nothing but his own body weight, for precisely 1 hour. Then breakfast, consumed methodically, every calorie accounted for. He read voraciously: military history, philosophy, technical manuals on subjects ranging from engineering to chemistry that the prison library somehow still carried. He never caused trouble, never raised his voice, never participated in the constant psychological warfare that defined life on the row. The other inmates had learned to give cell 14 a wide berth. There was something about Daniel Reeves that triggered ancient survival instincts, the recognition that certain predators were best left undisturbed, except for Walter Green. Cell 17, 3 doors down, housed a man who represented everything Daniel was not. Where Daniel moved with lethal efficiency, Walter shuffled with the uncertain gait of someone whose body had begun betraying him. At 67 years old, with thinning white hair and hands that trembled from early-stage Parkinson's, Walter looked like someone's grandfather who'd wandered into the wrong building and couldn't find his way out. He'd been on death row for 18 months, convicted of murdering his business partner in a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a witness who'd later recanted, too late to matter legally, but early enough to haunt anyone who bothered to read the appeals. Walter maintained his innocence with a quiet dignity that broke something in the few guards who still possessed functioning consciences. He'd been a high school mathematics teacher for 38 years before his arrest, the kind of man who volunteered at homeless shelters on weekends and sent most of his modest pension to his daughter's children. Prison had been systematically destroying him. The noise, the violence, the constant threat, it was all slowly grinding Walter Green into dust. His hands shook worse each month. His sleep was fractured by nightmares. The medication for his Parkinson's was frequently lost in the Byzantine bureaucracy of the prison medical system, leaving him to suffer through tremors that made eating difficult and writing impossible. Worse were the predators who'd identified him as prey. The Kozlov brothers, Victor and Alexei, occupied cells 8 and 9, close enough to coordinate but separated enough to avoid being placed in solitary together. They were part of the Eastern European organized crime pipeline that had flooded American prisons over the past decade. Men who'd grown up in a world where violence was currency and mercy was weakness. Victor, the elder at 34, had been convicted of 3 murders tied to a human trafficking operation. Alexei, 2 years younger, had added 2 more bodies to the family tally before his arrest. In the outside world, they'd been enforcers. In Coldwater, they'd become royalty. They controlled the flow of contraband, drugs, weapons, information through a network that extended far beyond death row. Guards supplemented their meager salaries by looking the other way. Other inmates paid tribute in whatever they could offer. Those who refused or couldn't pay found themselves on the receiving end of violence that stopped just short of killing, because corpses attracted investigations that were bad for business. Walter Green had nothing to offer and no capacity to defend himself, which made him perfect for a different kind of currency: entertainment. It had started small 3 months ago. Accidental collisions in the corridor during the daily hour of recreation. Food trays knocked from Walter's shaking hands in the cafeteria. Comments in Russian that needed no translation, delivered with smiles that showed too many teeth. The guards watched it happen with the studied disinterest of people who'd learned that intervening only made them targets. Walter had endured it with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything, apologizing even when he was clearly the victim, trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable, less vulnerable. It hadn't worked. Prey behavior only excited predators. 2 weeks ago, it had escalated. Victor had cornered Walter during recreation, pressing him against the chain-link fence of the yard while Alexei and their associates formed a screen blocking the view of the guard towers. No one had seen exactly what happened, but Walter had limped for 3 days afterward and refused to discuss it with the prison doctor. Daniel had watched it all from his usual position in the corner of the recreation yard, back to the wall, eyes tracking everything, saying nothing. The other inmates had learned not to approach him during rec time. He never participated in the basketball games, never joined the clusters of men trading gossip and contraband, never did anything but study the space with those cold blue eyes as if he were memorizing a battlefield. But he'd noticed Walter, and he'd noticed the Kozlovs. On a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week before this particular Tuesday, something had shifted in the delicate ecosystem of death row. Walter had been shuffling toward the showers, moving with the careful steps of someone whose body no longer reliably obeyed commands, when Victor had stepped into his path. The collision had been deliberately engineered. Victor had timed it perfectly, then made a great show of stumbling backward. Stupid old man. Victor's English carried a thick accent that he exaggerated for effect. You blind or just stupid? Walter had started to apologize, as he always did, his trembling hands held up in a placating gesture. Victor had grabbed one of those hands and squeezed, grinding the fragile bones together until Walter's face had gone white with pain. Daniel had been returning from his own shower, towel over his shoulder, moving with his usual silent efficiency. He'd stopped 10 feet away, water still dripping from his close-cropped hair, and watched the scene unfold. Please, Walter had whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. Please, I didn't mean... Victor had squeezed harder, and Walter's knees had buckled. That's when Daniel had spoken for the first time in 3 years to anyone other than guards. Let him go. His voice had been quiet, barely above a conversational tone, but something in it had cut through the ambient noise of the block like a blade through silk. Victor had looked up, surprised to discover that Cell 14 had a voice. Alexei had emerged from the shadows, always nearby when his brother was working, flanked by 2 more members of their crew, Dmitri and Pavel, both convicted killers serving life sentences in the general population but with easy access to death row through their connections. Or what, dead man? Victor had grinned, still crushing Walter's hand. You want to die faster? Daniel hadn't responded. He'd simply looked at Victor with those pale blue eyes, his expression utterly neutral, and something about that gaze had made Victor release Walter's hand and take an involuntary step backward before catching himself. The moment had passed. Victor had laughed, made a joke in Russian that his brother and crew had found hilarious, and they'd moved on. Walter had collapsed against the wall, cradling his injured hand, looking up at Daniel with an expression of profound gratitude. Daniel had offered his hand and helped Walter to his feet with surprising gentleness. Stay close to your cell during rec time, he'd said quietly. Don't give them opportunities. It had been the beginning of an unlikely alliance. Daniel had started positioning himself strategically during the daily routines, close enough to Walter to discourage casual violence, far enough to avoid drawing attention to the protection. He never spoke to Walter directly in view of others, never made the protection obvious enough to challenge the Kozlovs' authority, never did anything that would force a confrontation. But the Kozlovs had noticed, and Victor in particular had taken it as a challenge to his authority. Now, on this Tuesday morning, as Daniel completed his routine and prepared for breakfast, he felt the familiar tension in the air that preceded violence. He'd spent enough years in hostile territories to recognize when something was about to break. The guards were more alert than usual, their hands resting on batons. The other inmates were staying close to their cells, reluctant to venture into the common areas. Something was coming. Daniel could feel it in his bones, that old combat instinct that had kept him alive in places where mistakes measured survival in seconds. He was right. The breakfast bell rang at 7:30 a.m. with its usual metallic clang, echoing off the concrete walls like a death knell. Daniel moved through the routine with practiced efficiency, cell door sliding open electronically, the shuffle of orange jumpsuits as 37 condemned men emerged into the corridor, the smell of industrial-grade oatmeal and burnt coffee wafting from the cafeteria at the end of the block. Walter Green appeared in his doorway 3 cells down, moving slower than usual. His left hand, the one Victor had crushed the week before, was wrapped in an improvised bandage, torn strips of undershirt that the prison medical staff had deemed sufficient treatment. His tremor seemed worse this morning, his whole body exhibiting that slight shake that spoke to missed medications and accumulated stress. Daniel fell into step several paces behind Walter, maintaining the careful distance that had become their unspoken arrangement, close enough to respond, far enough to avoid making the protection obvious. The corridor was a river of orange flowing toward the cafeteria, guards stationed at intervals, their body language suggesting they expected trouble, but weren't particularly interested in preventing it. The cafeteria was a brutalist cathedral of reinforced concrete and steel, 30 long tables bolted to the floor, cameras in every corner that worked about half the time, and a serving line where inmates in general population dished out meals that barely qualified as food. The death row inmates ate separately from general population, a security protocol that did nothing to prevent the intricate web of alliances and enmities from forming. Daniel collected his tray, oatmeal, 2 pieces of white bread, an apple that had seen better days, coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through a boot, and moved toward his usual spot in the back corner. It gave him a clear line of sight to the entire room, his back protected by 2 walls, exits calculated and memorized. Walter was 3 people behind him in line, moving with that shuffling gait, his damaged hand making it difficult to hold the tray steady. He was almost to the tables when Victor materialized from the crowd like a shark, sensing blood in the water. "Old Man Green!" Victor's voice carried across the cafeteria, artificially cheerful. "You look like shit this morning. Maybe you die soon, save the state some money, yes?" Laughter rippled through the tables controlled by the Kozlov network. A dozen men who understood that their survival depended on maintaining the brothers' favor. Walter tried to ignore it, keeping his eyes down, focusing on not dropping his tray. His trembling was worse now, anxiety amplifying the Parkinson's into something almost violent. Alexei appeared on Walter's other side, boxing him in with Victor, a choreographed predator's dance they'd perfected over months. "My brother asks you question, old man." Very rude not to answer. "I'm sorry," Walter whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm just trying to—" Victor's hand shot out and slapped the tray from Walter's grip. Oatmeal exploded across the concrete floor, the metal tray clattering with a sound that made everyone in the cafeteria look up. Walter stared at the mess, then at Victor, then at his own trembling hands, and something broke in his expression. The accumulated weight of 18 months of abuse finally exceeding what one old man could bear. "Please," Walter said, and there were tears in his voice now. "Please, I can't. I don't." "You don't what?" Victor stepped closer, invading Walter's space, using his bulk. 6'2" and 200 pounds of muscle built in prison yards across 3 countries to intimidate. You don't want to clean up your mess, but you make it, so you clean it. Get on your knees, old man. Lick it up. The cafeteria had gone silent. Even the guards had stopped pretending not to notice, though none of them moved to intervene. This was the moment when the social order of the block was reinforced, when everyone was reminded of their place in the hierarchy. Walter, on his knees, literally licking the floor, would send a message that echoed far beyond this single humiliation. Walter's knees started to bend, some survival instinct overriding dignity, telling him that submission was the only path that didn't end with his skull cracked against the concrete. His trembling hands reached out to steady himself as he lowered toward the floor, toward the oatmeal spreading across the dirty concrete, toward the final destruction of whatever remained of Walter Green's sense of self. Daniel stood up. The sound of his boots on the concrete carried in the silence like gunshots. Every eye in the cafeteria tracked his movement as he crossed the distance between his table and the cluster forming around Walter. 30 feet that felt like 30 miles, each step deliberate and measured. He didn't hurry, didn't run, just walked with that unsettling economy of motion that suggested a man who'd covered a lot of ground in places where hurrying got you killed. He stopped 5 feet from Victor, close enough to smell the cheap prison soap and the particular scent of violence that preceded action. His pale blue eyes settled on Victor's face with the same calm intensity he'd shown the week before. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet certainty that had frozen the corridor. Step back. Victor turned to face him fully, genuinely surprised. Alexei moved to flank his brother, and Dmitri and Pavel materialized from their table, forming a semicircle of violence waiting to be unleashed. 4 against 1, and the 4 were men who'd built reputations on their willingness to hurt people. The dead man speaks again, Victor said, smiling with too many teeth. What is this, you want to die for this old piece of shit? You want to be hero? I want you to step back, Daniel repeated, his tone unchanged, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than standing against 4 killers in a room full of witnesses. Or what? Victor spread his arms wide, playing to the audience now. You going to do something? You going to fight? Look around, dead man. You think any of these people help you? You think guards care? He gestured at the 2 correctional officers standing by the door, both of whom had studiously fixed their attention on the walls. This is our house, we do what we want, and right now I want to watch this old man lick the floor. Then maybe I deal with you. Daniel didn't look around. Didn't check the odds or calculate the angles in any visible way. He simply stood there, that disturbing calm radiating from him like heat from a furnace, and said quietly, "Last chance. Step back." Victor's smile disappeared. In its place came something colder, more honest, the face of a man who'd hurt a lot of people and enjoyed it. Fuck you. His fist came up fast, a straight right aimed at Daniel's face with the kind of power that had shattered jaws and noses across 3 continents. It was the punch of someone who knew how to fight, who'd learned violence in places where losing meant dying. Daniel moved. Not backward or to the side, but forward and slightly left, inside the arc of the punch, so close that Victor's fist whispered past his ear without making contact. His left hand came up in a movement almost too fast to follow, fingers extended, striking Victor in the throat with surgical precision. Not hard enough to crush the windpipe completely, but hard enough to close it significantly, turning Victor's triumphant aggression into choking panic. Victor stumbled backward, hands going to his throat, eyes wide with shock and the primal terror of not being able to breathe. Alexei lunged forward with a roar, swinging wildly, but Daniel had already pivoted, using Victor's stumbling body as a shield. Alexei's punch caught his brother in the ribs instead, and Daniel slipped behind Victor, his right arm snaking around the bigger man's neck in a rear naked choke that looked almost gentle in its application, but was anything but. Victor's face went purple, then gray. His hands clawed at Daniel's arm, but the angle was wrong, the leverage impossible. Daniel held him there for exactly 5 seconds, long enough to demonstrate complete control, short enough to avoid permanent damage, then released him. Victor dropped to his knees, gasping and coughing, tears streaming down his face. Dmitri and Pavel charged simultaneously from opposite sides, trying to overwhelm Daniel with numbers and aggression. Daniel dropped low, sweeping Dmitri's legs out from under him with a precision that suggested countless hours of practice, then rose into Pavel's charge, deflecting the bigger man's momentum and using it against him, sending Pavel crashing into a table with enough force to crack 2 ribs. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. 4 men who controlled the block through violence now occupied various positions on the floor, groaning and trying to understand what had just happened to them. Daniel stood in the center of the wreckage, breathing normally, not even winded, his orange jumpsuit barely wrinkled. He looked down at Victor, who was still on his knees, clutching his throat, and spoke in that same quiet voice that somehow carried to every corner of the silent cafeteria. Encosta nele de novo. The words were Portuguese, touch him again, delivered with an accent that suggested native fluency, utterly incongruous coming from this blonde-haired, blue-eyed man who'd been silent for 3 years. But the meaning transcended language. Every man in that cafeteria understood the promise beneath the words. Victor looked up at Daniel with an expression that mixed rage, humiliation, and for the first time in years, genuine fear. Then the guards finally moved, batons drawn, shouting commands that came far too late to prevent what had already happened. Daniel raised his hands slowly, fingers spread, offering no resistance as they surrounded him. They slammed him against the wall with unnecessary force, cuffing his hands behind his back with the metal biting into his wrists. But Daniel's expression never changed. That same unsettling calm, as if being thrown against the wall, was exactly what he'd expected. As they dragged him toward the door, Daniel's eyes found Walter, who was standing exactly where he'd been, tray forgotten, staring at Daniel with an expression of wonder and horror. Daniel gave him the smallest nod, "You're safe now," before disappearing into the corridor. The cafeteria remained frozen for another 3 seconds, processing what they'd witnessed, before conversation exploded like a breaking dam. Victor was helped to his feet by other members of his crew, his face a mask of humiliation and murderous intent. Alexei collected Dmitri and Pavel, both men moving gingerly, pain written in every movement. But everyone was looking at the door where Daniel had disappeared, recalculating everything they thought they knew about the silent man in cell 14. In the warden's office 2 floors above, Director Marcus Holloway was reviewing budget reports when his desk phone rang, with the priority tone that indicated something requiring immediate attention. He picked it up, listened for 30 seconds, then hung up, and stared at the wall where photographs of every warden who'd run Coldwater hung in chronological order. Stern men in stern poses, faces that suggested varying degrees of competence and corruption. "Reeves," he said to the empty office, the name carrying weight. He'd been warden for 8 years, had processed hundreds of death row inmates, but Daniel Reeves had always been different. Too controlled, too aware, too dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the crimes he'd been convicted of. Holloway had read Reeves's file, had read it multiple times in fact, because something about the case had never sat right. 4 men dead in a Philadelphia warehouse, killed with professional precision. No witnesses except a homeless man who'd been 3 blocks away. Physical evidence that placed Reeves at the scene but offered no context for why. A trial that moved with unusual speed through a system usually defined by glacial bureaucracy. And Reeves himself, sitting silent through it all, accepting a death sentence as if it were an expected outcome rather than a catastrophic failure of justice. Now Reeves had broken his silence and his pattern of nonviolence in the most spectacular way possible, taking apart 4 of the most dangerous men in the facility in less time than it took to tie a shoe. The security footage would be waiting for Holloway's review, but the description from the guards was enough to paint a picture. This wasn't prison brawling or lucky punches. This was training, professional training of a type that didn't come from street fighting or gang warfare. Holloway pulled up Reeves's file on his computer, scrolling past the conviction details to the sections he'd always found suspicious. Employment history, listed as security consultant with a firm called Convergent Solutions, which further investigation revealed was a shell company that had dissolved 2 weeks after Reeves's arrest. Education, listed as some college at institutions that had no record of his attendance. Military service, blank. which was strange for someone his age with his obvious physical conditioning. Someone had scrubbed Daniel Reeves' past very thoroughly. The question was why. And the bigger question, the one that was beginning to form in Holloway's mind as he prepared to deal with the situation in his facility, was whether Daniel Reeves was actually guilty of the crimes that had put him on death row, or whether someone had very carefully arranged for a dangerous man to be locked away where he couldn't ask questions or cause problems. The phone rang again. This time it was the State Corrections Commissioner, calling about the incident before Holloway had even finished reading the initial report. That level of attention was unusual for a simple prison fight. Someone very high up was very interested in Daniel Reeves. As Holloway took the call, 3 floors below in solitary confinement, Daniel sat on a concrete bench in a cell that measured 6 feet by 8 feet, with no windows and a steel door that would remain closed for at least the next 30 days. His hands were finally uncuffed, though his wrists showed deep bruises from the metal. He examined them with clinical detachment, flexing his fingers, ensuring nothing was broken. Then he closed his eyes and allowed himself the smallest smile. The game had finally begun. 30 days in solitary confinement passed like 30 seconds for Daniel Reeves, where other men descended into madness from the sensory deprivation, the endless silence broken only by distant screams, the fluorescent light that never turned off, the meals pushed through a slot without human contact. Daniel thrived in the isolation. He'd spent longer periods in worse conditions, though those memories belonged to a life he was no longer supposed to have lived. He maintained his routine with even greater discipline. Physical training adapted to the smaller space, burpees, handstand push-ups against the wall, isometric holds that required no equipment and left no evidence of exertion beyond the slight sheen of sweat on his skin. Mental exercises that kept his mind sharp, running through scenarios and contingencies, languages and technical specifications, the accumulated knowledge of a career that officially didn't exist. The guards who delivered his meals learned quickly not to attempt conversation. Daniel accepted each tray with a polite nod, ate methodically, returned the tray to the slot, then resumed whatever he'd been doing. No requests, no complaints, no deterioration into the animalistic state that solitary confinement usually produced. It unsettled them more than violence would have. On day 31, the steel door opened at 6:00 a.m. exactly, and Daniel emerged into the corridor to find not the usual escort of 2 guards, but 4, plus Warden Holloway himself. The warden was a tall man in his late 50s, with iron gray hair cut military short, and eyes that had seen enough prison violence to become professionally suspicious of everything. "Reeves," Holloway said, studying Daniel the way a zoologist might study an unexpected species. "You're being transferred back to general death row population. There will be conditions." Daniel nodded once, waiting. "You will have no contact with Walter Green. You will not approach within 10 feet of any member of the Kozlov organization. You will speak only when spoken to by staff. Any deviation from these conditions results in permanent solitary until your execution date. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir." Daniel's voice carried no resentment, no resistance, just calm acknowledgement. Holloway studied him for another moment, then gestured to the guards. "Take him back to cell 14. Full escort protocol." The walk back to death row was a journey through a gauntlet of stairs. Word of what had happened in the cafeteria had spread through the prison's intricate communication networks, whispered through ventilation grates, passed through corrupted guards, encoded in the elaborate system of gestures and signals that inmates use to communicate across barriers. The silent man from cell 14 had taken apart 4 of the most dangerous men in the facility in 10 seconds, then walked to solitary without resistance. The story had grown in the telling, as prison stories always did. Some versions had Daniel killing all 4 men before the guards intervened. Others claimed he'd moved so fast the security cameras couldn't track him. A few insisted he must be some kind of government agent, planted in the prison for reasons no one could quite articulate. The truth was disturbing enough without embellishment. Cell 14 was exactly as Daniel had left it, Spartan, organized, the books on his shelf arranged by subject and size. He stepped inside, heard the door lock behind him with its usual metallic finality, and resumed his routine as if the past 30 days had been nothing more than a brief interruption. 3 cells down, Walter Green heard the sound of Daniel's return and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since the cafeteria incident. The 30 days of Daniel's absence had been the longest 1,800 hours of Walter's life. The Kozlovs had left him alone, but the threat hung over everything. An unspoken promise that Daniel's protection was temporary, that eventually the math would work out in their favor, that Walter would pay for the humiliation Victor had suffered. Walter had spent those 30 days expecting each moment to be his last comfortable one, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. Now Daniel was back, and Walter felt a relief so profound it was almost painful. He wanted to call out, to thank Daniel, to acknowledge the debt he could never repay. But he understood the conditions of Daniel's return, understood that any contact would send Daniel back to solitary, so Walter simply closed his eyes and whispered a prayer to a God he wasn't sure was listening, thanking him for the existence of Daniel Reeves. The day proceeded with eerie normalcy. Breakfast passed without incident. The Kozlovs ate at their table while Daniel sat alone at his, the distance between them charged with unspoken tension. Recreation hour found Daniel in his usual corner of the yard, back to the wall, eyes tracking everything. The Kozlovs and their crew occupied the opposite corner, Victor's eyes never leaving Daniel, his expression promising future violence that his body language suggested he wasn't quite ready to deliver. It was a stalemate, and everyone in the yard understood it. Daniel had demonstrated capabilities that changed the calculus of power in the facility. Victor couldn't let the humiliation stand, but he also couldn't risk another direct confrontation without a significant advantage. The game had become more complex, more dangerous, more interesting. At 2:37 p.m., during the dead hours between lunch and dinner when death row inmates were locked in their cells with nothing but time and regret for company, Daniel heard his cell door unlock electronically. Unusual, unscheduled, the kind of deviation from routine that demanded attention. 2 guards appeared, neither of whom Daniel recognized from the usual death row rotation. Behind them stood a woman in a dark charcoal suit that screamed federal government, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than a guard's monthly salary. She was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp eyes behind wire-frame glasses, and the kind of posture that suggested either military service or expensive private schools that taught the same bearing. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice carrying a neutral professional tone that revealed nothing. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm an investigator with the Department of Justice Criminal Division. I need to speak with you about your case. We can do this here, or we can go to a private interview room. Your choice." Daniel stood slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Interview room," he said quietly. "Fewer ears." Sarah Mitchell nodded as if she'd expected that response and gestured for the guards to escort Daniel. They moved through the corridors with the same full protocol that had marked his return from solitary. 4 guards, maximum distance, hands visible at all times. Other inmates watched through their cell bars as Daniel passed, curiosity written on every face. The interview room was a concrete box 10 feet square, furnished with a metal table bolted to the floor and 4 chairs that had seen better decades. A camera in the corner recorded everything, its red light glowing like a malevolent eye. Sarah Mitchell waited until the guards had secured Daniel to the table, wrist cuffs attached to a steel ring welded to the surface, and left the room before she opened her briefcase and extracted a thick folder. "Let's start with the basics," she said, sitting across from him with the folder closed in front of her. "You were convicted 3 years ago of 4 counts of first-degree murder. 4 men killed in a warehouse in South Philadelphia. Marcus Chen, age 32, David Kowalski, age 28, James Patterson, age 41, and Robert Vance, age 36. All shot twice, center mass and head, with a 9mm handgun that was recovered at the scene with your fingerprints on it. You were arrested 6 blocks away, covered in gunpowder residue, with no alibi and no explanation. You refused to testify at your trial. You accepted a death sentence without appeal. Does that sound accurate?" Daniel met her eyes with that unsettling calm. Yes. Why? Why what? Why did you kill them? Why didn't you defend yourself? Why accept death? Sarah leaned forward slightly, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal genuine curiosity beneath. I've reviewed hundreds of cases, Mr. Reeves. Guilty men fight, innocent men fight harder. But you just accepted it. That's not normal. Daniel was silent for a long moment, his pale blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made Sarah want to look away, but forced herself to hold his gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried absolute certainty. Because I did kill them, and because I deserved the death sentence. Sarah opened the folder, extracting a photograph, surveillance footage from a traffic camera 3 blocks from the warehouse, showing Daniel walking away from the scene. No visible blood, no signs of distress, just a man walking with purpose. This was taken 8 minutes after the murders. You don't look like someone who just killed 4 people in a rage. You look like someone completing a mission. Daniel said nothing. Sarah pulled out another document, the autopsy reports. All 4 victims were shot with professional precision, the kind of shooting that requires training, significant training, military-grade training. But your record shows no military service. Your employment history is a shell company that dissolved immediately after your arrest. Your education history has gaps that make no sense. So let me ask you directly, Mr. Reeves. Who are you really? I'm a man on death row for murder. That's what you are now. I'm asking who you were before. Sarah's voice hardened slightly, frustration creeping into her professional demeanor. I've been investigating your case for 6 months, Mr. Reeves. 6 months of pulling threads that go nowhere, of finding records that have been scrubbed, of running into walls that shouldn't exist in a simple murder case. And then 31 days ago, you took apart 4 violent criminals in less time than it takes most people to react. I've watched that security footage 20 times. What you did in that cafeteria, that's not prison brawling, that's combat training. Elite combat training, the kind that takes years to develop and only a handful of organizations in the world can provide. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. Sarah pressed on. 3 of the 4 men you killed, Chen, Patterson, and Vance, all had connections to a Chinese intelligence front company operating in Philadelphia. The 4th, Kowalski, was former CIA, discharged under circumstances that remain classified. That's not random, Mr. Reeves. That's a pattern. And patterns suggest organization, planning, purpose. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing Daniel from his arrest, the gunpowder residue on his hands, the complete absence of blood spatter on his clothes despite shooting 4 men at close range. You weren't just careful. You were professional. And then you let yourself be arrested without a fight, accepted conviction without a defense, and settled into death row like you were waiting for something. Maybe I was waiting to die, Daniel said quietly. I don't think so. Sarah closed the folder and leaned back, her eyes never leaving his face. I think you were waiting for the right person to ask the right questions. And I think I'm that person, Mr. Reeves. Because 6 months ago I was assigned to review wrongful conviction cases in Pennsylvania. Your case wasn't on my list, it should have been straightforward. But then I found Walter Green's file and I found his connection to you, and I started pulling threads. And those threads led me to discover that someone very powerful wants you exactly where you are. Silent, discredited, and scheduled for execution. Daniel's hands, still cuffed to the table, flexed slightly, the first visible sign of tension since the interview began. Let me tell you what I think happened, Sarah continued, her voice softer now, almost gentle. I think you were working for someone, probably government, probably classified. I think whatever you were doing in that warehouse wasn't murder. It was a sanctioned operation that went wrong, or maybe went exactly right, depending on whose perspective we're taking. I think those 4 men were legitimate targets, and I think someone decided it was more convenient to make you disappear than to explain what really happened. Am I close? The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, heavy with implication and danger. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't before. If you're right, and I'm not saying you are, then asking these questions makes you a threat to very powerful people. The kind of people who make problems disappear permanently. You should walk away from this, Ms. Mitchell. File your report, recommend no further action, and forget Daniel Reeves exists. That's not going to happen. Then you're going to die. Daniel's voice held no emotion, just flat certainty. Maybe a car accident, maybe a random mugging, maybe you just disappear one day and become another cold case. But they will kill you, because you're asking questions they went to a lot of trouble to ensure no one would ever ask. Sarah met his eyes without flinching. I'm willing to take that risk if it means an innocent man doesn't die for crimes he didn't commit. I'm not innocent, Ms. Mitchell. I killed those 4 men, that's a fact. Whether it was justified or sanctioned doesn't change the bodies or the damage. Justice, in its own strange way, is being served. But the truth isn't. Sarah's voice carried conviction now, passion breaking through her professional veneer. And truth matters, Mr. Reeves. It matters because right now, Walter Green is on death row for a murder he didn't commit. It matters because Victor Kozlov is using this prison as his personal kingdom while guards look the other way. It matters because if someone can make you disappear, they can make anyone disappear. So I'm not walking away. I'm going to find out who you really are, what you were really doing in that warehouse, and why someone wants you dead badly enough to corrupt an entire judicial proceeding. Daniel studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then let me give you some free advice, Ms. Mitchell. Don't trust anyone in the chain of command who had anything to do with my case. Not the prosecutor, not the judge, not the arresting officers. Don't use official channels to investigate, because they're monitoring those channels. And most importantly, don't come back here. Whatever you find, whatever you discover, don't connect it to me publicly until you have enough evidence to make it stick, because the moment they know you're closing in, they'll burn everything, including you, including me, including everyone in this facility if necessary. Why are you helping me? Daniel's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Because you remind me of someone. Someone who believed truth mattered more than convenience. Someone who died because she asked the right questions at the wrong time. He looked down at his cuffed hands, then back up at Sarah. And because 3 years is a long time to sit in a cell wondering if maybe you made the wrong choice by staying silent. Sarah stood, closing her briefcase with a soft click. I'll be in touch, Mr. Reeves, through unofficial channels, and I'll find the truth, whatever it costs. I know you will, Daniel said quietly. That's what worries me. The guards returned to escort Daniel back to his cell. As they walked through the corridors, Daniel's mind was already running through scenarios and contingencies, calculating the risks and opportunities that Sarah Mitchell's investigation represented. He'd maintained his silence for 3 years, protecting secrets that powerful people had buried beneath his conviction. Now someone was digging, and the carefully constructed house of cards was beginning to tremble. In cell 8, Victor Kozlov watched Daniel return from the interview through the bars of his cell, his expression thoughtful. Something had changed. He could see it in the subtle shift of Daniel's posture, the slight tension that suggested wheels turning behind those pale blue eyes. Victor pulled a small cell phone from its hiding place, smuggled in piece by piece over 6 months, assembled with patience and bribed guards, and sent a text message to a number that connected to networks far beyond the prison walls. The dead man had a visitor, federal investigator. She was asking questions. The response came back within minutes. Handle it. Make it look like prison business. Victor smiled, showing too many teeth, and began planning how best to kill Daniel Reeves in a way that would satisfy both his need for revenge and his employer's need for permanent silence. The game had indeed become more interesting. Sarah Mitchell's rental car, a nondescript gray Camry that could disappear into any parking lot in America, sat in the underground garage of a budget hotel 3 miles from Coldwater State Penitentiary. She'd chosen the location deliberately, far enough from the prison to avoid obvious surveillance, cheap enough that federal investigators wouldn't naturally stay there, anonymous enough that the desk clerk had barely glanced at her fake ID before handing over the key card. The room itself was exactly what 12 years of government service had taught her to expect. Thin walls, thinner mattress, the smell of industrial cleaner failing to mask decades of transient humanity. But the Wi-Fi worked, and the door had a deadbolt that actually engaged, which made it suitable for what she needed. She spread the contents of her briefcase across the bed, photocopies of Daniel Reeves's case file, printed articles about the warehouse murders, photographs of the crime scene that she'd obtained through channels that existed in bureaucratic gray areas. 6 months of investigation reduced to paper and ink, a puzzle with too many missing pieces and edges that didn't quite align. Sarah had been with the Department of Justice's Criminal Division for 8 years, specializing in wrongful conviction reviews. She'd overturned 12 convictions in that time, freed men who'd spent decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit, exposed prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption that went back generations. She was good at her job because she understood that justice was a human construction, and humans made mistakes, or sometimes deliberate choices that served interests other than truth. But Daniel Reeves was different. Everything about his case screamed wrongful conviction. The rushed trial, the lack of defense, the circumstantial evidence, the defendant's strange passivity. Yet Reeves himself insisted he was guilty, accepted his death sentence with disturbing calm, and showed no interest in the appeals process that might have saved his life. Until their conversation 3 hours ago, Sarah had been operating on the assumption that Reeves was either mentally ill or protecting someone. Now she understood the truth was far more complicated and far more dangerous. She opened her laptop, a personal device, not her government-issued one, purchased with cash from a pawn shop in Baltimore and loaded with encryption software that would have raised red flags if anyone in her office knew she possessed it. Years of investigating corruption had taught Sarah that official channels were only secure until they weren't, and that the people most likely to compromise those channels were the ones sworn to protect them. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up databases that required clearances she technically possessed but wasn't supposed to use for cases outside her official assignment. She started with the victims: Marcus Chen, David Kowalski, James Patterson, Robert Vance. 4 men connected by death and, if Sarah's instincts were correct, by something far more significant than random violence. Marcus Chen first, age 32 at time of death. Born in San Francisco to immigrant parents, graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in computer engineering, worked for 3 different tech companies before his employment history went dark. The last official record had him employed by a firm called Pacific Rim Solutions, which a deeper search revealed was a subsidiary of a company that did contract work for the National Security Agency. Not just tech, intelligence tech, the kind that lived in shadows and never appeared on quarterly earnings reports. David Kowalski, age 28, former CIA, as Sarah had told Reeves, but the circumstances of his discharge were sealed under classifications that even Sarah's access couldn't penetrate. What she could find was concerning: psychological evaluations that suggested difficulty adapting to operational parameters and insufficient regard for established protocols. Intelligence speak for someone who'd gone off the reservation, who'd stopped following rules that existed for good reasons. James Patterson, age 41, the oldest of the 4 victims and the hardest to trace. His employment history was a maze of security companies and logistics firms, but a pattern emerged if you looked carefully enough. Every company he'd worked for had connections, however distant, to Chinese state-owned enterprises. Not unusual in global business, except that Patterson's work always involved security, always involved sensitive locations, always involved access to information that shouldn't have been accessible. Robert Vance, age 36, former Army Ranger, decorated service in Iraq and Afghanistan, medical discharge following an IED incident that left him with a traumatic brain injury. Except the medical records didn't quite match the discharge paperwork. The injury was documented, but the psychological evaluation suggested someone who was cleared for continued service. So why the discharge? Why the return to civilian life at a moment when his skills would have been most valuable? Sarah sat back, studying the pattern emerging from the data. 4 men, all with intelligence or military backgrounds, all with connections to classified operations or sensitive information, all killed in a warehouse in Philadelphia on a cold February night 3 years ago. And Daniel Reeves, whose official history was so thoroughly scrubbed it might as well have been fiction, arrested 6 blocks away with gunpowder on his hands and no explanation. She pulled up the Philadelphia Police Department's incident report from that night. The arresting officers were Detectives James Carver and Michelle Rodriguez, both veterans with 20-plus years on the force. The arrest had been routine. Patrol officers spotted Reeves walking away from the general direction of the warehouse, noted his disheveled appearance and the smell of gunpowder, called in the detectives who happened to be close by. Reeves had surrendered without resistance, said nothing beyond confirming his name, and maintained that silence through processing and arraignment. Too convenient. Too clean. As if someone had been waiting for exactly this arrest to occur. Sarah opened a new search window and typed in the names of the detectives. Carver first. Decorated officer, multiple commendations, 3 years from retirement at the time of Reeves's arrest. He'd retired 2 months after the conviction, moved to Florida, purchased a house on the beach for cash. The house was worth $1, $2 million. Carver's pension and savings, according to financial records that Sarah probably shouldn't have been accessing, wouldn't have covered a quarter of that purchase. Rodriguez next, equally decorated, younger by 10 years, still active on the force. Her financial records showed similar anomalies. A new car purchased with cash 3 months after the trial, a college fund for her daughter that had suddenly appeared fully funded, credit card debt that had disappeared overnight. Nothing provable without a full forensic audit, but enough to suggest that someone had rewarded both detectives very generously for their role in Reeves's arrest and conviction. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming text from a number she didn't recognize. She stared at it for a long moment before opening the message, every instinct screaming that engaging with unknown contacts was how investigators ended up dead in hotel rooms ruled as suicides. You're asking questions about Philadelphia. Stop. Her hands tightened on the phone. The message had come through a secure app that she'd installed for precisely this kind of communication. Encrypted, untraceable, designed for whistleblowers and sources who couldn't risk official channels. Someone was watching her investigation. Someone who had access to surveillance capabilities that exceeded normal law enforcement. She typed back, "Who is this?" The response came within seconds. Someone who knows what happens to people who dig into Reeves. The last investigator is buried in Arlington. The one before that drowned in her bathtub. Walk away while you can still walk. Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach. She pulled up another search, this time looking for federal investigators who died in the past 3 years under unusual circumstances. The results were sobering. 2 DOJ attorneys, both assigned to cases involving classified intelligence operations, both dead within weeks of opening certain lines of inquiry. One in a car accident on a clear day on a straight road. One in her home, officially ruled accidental drowning despite being an accomplished swimmer. The pattern was there if you knew to look for it. And now Sarah was part of that pattern. Another investigator asking dangerous questions about Daniel Reeves and the warehouse murders. She should walk away, file a report recommending no further action, except that some truths were too dangerous to uncover. Go back to her safe cases, her wrongful convictions that involved corrupt small-town police departments and overzealous prosecutors. Cases where the worst thing that happened was a few careers ended and some money changed hands. Instead, she typed, "I'm not walking away. If you want to help, tell me what Reeves was really doing in that warehouse." The response took longer this time, 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours, Sarah watching the screen and wondering if she'd just signed her own death warrant. When the message finally came, it was longer, more detailed, and more terrifying than she'd expected. Reeves was agency, deep cover for 6 years. The operation in Philadelphia was sanctioned. Target was a Chinese intelligence cell selling NSA cyber weapons to highest bidders. The 4 men Reeves killed were part of the sale. But something went wrong. The buyers were supposed to be there. They weren't. Someone tipped them off. The operation was compromised from inside. Reeves was supposed to disappear after, but someone high up decided he knew too much. They burned him, manufactured evidence, rushed the trial, put him on death row where he couldn't talk. Now you're asking questions, which means they'll burn you too. This is your last warning. Sarah read the message 3 times, her mind racing through implications and connections. If this was true, if Reeves had been a CIA operative conducting a sanctioned mission, then his conviction wasn't just wrongful, it was a deliberate betrayal by the very agency he'd served, and the people responsible had the resources to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose that betrayal. She typed back, "Why are you telling me this? What do you want?" "I want the truth to come out. But I can't do it alone. They're watching me too closely. You're the first investigator to get this far without dying. Maybe you're smart enough to survive. Maybe you can actually do something with the information, or maybe you'll end up like the others. Either way, I've done what I can. Good luck, Ms. Mitchell. You're going to need it." The conversation ended. Sarah tried to send another message, but the app indicated the other user had deleted their account. Whoever had contacted her was gone, disappeared back into whatever shadows they operated from, leaving Sarah with information that was simultaneously invaluable and completely unprovable. She needed evidence. Real evidence that could survive scrutiny, that couldn't be dismissed as conspiracy theory or dismissed by the same people who'd orchestrated Reeves's conviction. She needed documentation, recordings, testimony from someone who couldn't be easily silenced. Her phone rang, her official government phone this time, the number showing her supervisor's direct line. Sarah stared at it, knowing that answering would require explanations she wasn't ready to give, that not answering would raise suspicions she couldn't afford. After the 4th ring, she picked up. "Mitchell." "Sarah, it's Howard." Howard Chen, her supervisor for the past 4 years. A career DOJ attorney who'd risen through the ranks by being competent, cautious, and completely dedicated to avoiding anything that might jeopardize his pension. "I just got a call from the Pennsylvania Corrections Commissioner. Something about you interviewing a death row inmate named Daniel Reeves. Want to tell me what that's about?" Sarah kept her voice professional, neutral. "Reeves came up in connection with the Walter Green case I'm reviewing. Green's on death row at the same facility. I thought there might be relevant information." "And was there?" "Nothing conclusive. Reeves maintains his conviction was appropriate. I don't see grounds for further investigation at this time." The lie came easily, the kind of bureaucratic non-answer that she'd perfected over years of navigating office politics and interdepartmental rivalries. Howard would accept it because he wanted to accept it, because the alternative was paperwork and attention and complications that threatened his comfortable existence. Good. Howard's relief was audible through the phone. "Look, Sarah, I know you're thorough. It's one of your best qualities. But the Green case is about Green, not about other inmates in the facility. Keep your focus narrow, file your report, and let's move on to the next case. We've got a backlog that won't clear itself." "Understood. I'll have the Green report on your desk by Friday." "Perfect. And Sarah? Be careful up there. Coldwater's not a nice place. Don't go looking for trouble where it doesn't exist." The call ended. Sarah set down the phone and realized her hands were shaking slightly. Adrenaline and fear mixing in her bloodstream, her body recognizing danger that her mind was still processing. Howard's call hadn't been routine check-in. Someone had flagged her visit to Reeves, had called the commissioner, had initiated a chain of communication designed to either shut down her investigation or identify her as a threat. The trap was closing. The question was whether she could escape it or whether she was already caught. She spent the next 3 hours searching databases and following digital trails, building a timeline of events around the Philadelphia warehouse murders. What emerged was a pattern of careful orchestration, evidence that appeared at exactly the right moments, witnesses who materialized with perfect timing, legal proceedings that moved with unusual speed. Every element of Reeves's conviction had been managed, guided, shaped by hands that remained invisible but were clearly competent. At 11:47 p.m., exhausted and running on coffee and anxiety, Sarah found something that made her stop scrolling and lean closer to the screen. A classified memo, buried in an NSA database that she'd accessed using credentials that would definitely get her fired if anyone discovered the breach. The memo was dated 4 days before the warehouse murders, marked "Top Secret Special Access Required," and addressed to a recipient whose name had been redacted. The content was brief. Operation Blacklight compromised. Possible internal leak. Recommend immediate shutdown and asset extraction. Continuation risks exposure of related programs. Below that, a handwritten note in the margin, partially obscured by the classification stamp. Asset refuses extraction. Insists on completing mission. Recommend contingency burn protocol if operation fails. Sarah sat back, her heart pounding. This was it. Evidence that Reeves's operation had been compromised before it even began. That someone inside the intelligence community had known the mission was compromised and had decided to let it proceed anyway. And contingency burn protocol was intelligence speak for eliminating any evidence of the operation's existence, including the operatives involved. They'd set Reeves up to fail, then arranged for his arrest and conviction to ensure his silence. It was elegant, ruthless, and completely illegal. She photographed the document with her personal phone, encrypted the files, and uploaded them to 3 separate secure servers under false credentials. If something happened to her, at least the evidence would exist somewhere. Then she packed her laptop, checked out of the hotel using cash to settle the bill, and drove through the dark Pennsylvania night toward Philadelphia. If Reeves had been CIA, there would be records, buried, classified, scrubbed from official databases, but existing somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machinery of American intelligence. She needed to find those records, needed to build a case that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed. What she didn't know was that 3 cars behind her, maintaining careful distance, a team of professionals was tracking her movements and reporting back to someone who'd already decided that Sarah Mitchell knew too much to be allowed to continue her investigation. Back at Coldwater, Daniel lay awake in his cell, listening to the familiar sounds of death row at night. Distant coughing, the shuffle of guards on patrol, the occasional scream of someone losing their battle with sanity. He'd known that talking to Sarah Mitchell would trigger responses, would set events in motion that might finally force the truth into the open. He'd also known it would put her in mortal danger. Daniel closed his eyes and ran through the skills he'd maintained even in confinement. The combat training, the tactical thinking, the cold calculation of how to survive against overwhelming odds. He'd accepted his fate 3 years ago, had made peace with dying for the mission that had consumed his life. But now someone was fighting for the truth, and Daniel found himself wanting to live long enough to see if Sarah Mitchell could succeed where he had failed. In Cell 8, Viktor Kozlov made a phone call on his smuggled cell phone, speaking in rapid Russian to contacts outside the prison. The conversation was brief, professional, and concerned with logistics, how to arrange for an investigator's car to experience brake failure on a mountain road, how to ensure the accident looked completely natural, how to eliminate a problem before it could grow larger. When Victor hung up, he smiled in the darkness. Killing the federal investigator would earn him favor with his employers. Killing Daniel Reeves afterward would satisfy his personal need for revenge. 2 birds, 1 stone. Elegant in its simplicity. The game was accelerating toward its conclusion, and only one question remained. Who would survive to see the final move? Sarah Mitchell's phone rang at 3:47 a.m., jerking her awake in the cramped driver's seat of her Camry parked behind a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Philadelphia. She'd driven for 4 hours straight after leaving the hotel, paranoia and caffeine keeping her alert, checking her mirrors obsessively for the surveillance she knew must be there. Somewhere around 2 a.m., exhaustion had finally overwhelmed adrenaline, and she'd pulled into this lot to rest for just a few minutes. The phone display showed unknown caller. Sarah's finger hovered over the decline button, but something made her answer instead. Yes? Ms. Mitchell. The voice was male, gravelly, with the particular roughness that came from decades of cigarettes and difficult conversations. My name is Gerald Hastings. I'm former CIA, retired 8 years ago. I need to meet with you about Daniel Reeves. Now, before they find you. Sarah was fully awake now, her hand instinctively moving to check that her car doors were locked. How did you get this number? The same way they got it, by monitoring your movement since you left Coldwater. The difference is I want to help you stay alive. They want the opposite. There's a church 3 blocks north of your current location, St. Michael's old stone building with a red door. Be there in 10 minutes. Come alone, come unarmed, and for God's sake, leave your phones in your car. All of them. The call ended before Sarah could respond. She sat in the dark parking lot, engine ticking as it cooled, weighing her options. This could be a trap designed to get her into an isolated location. Or it could be the break she desperately needed. Someone with inside knowledge willing to confirm what she'd learned about Reeves's true identity. The rational choice was to drive away, head back to Washington, file her report, and let someone else deal with this mess. The survival choice. Sarah had never been particularly good at making the survival choice. She pulled both her phones from her purse, the government phone and her personal device, and locked them in the glove compartment. Then she checked her backup weapon, a compact Glock 43 she carried in violation of about 6 different federal regulations, before remembering Hastings' instruction to come unarmed. After a moment's hesitation, she locked the gun in the glove box too. St. Michael's was exactly where Hastings had described, a Gothic revival structure that looked like it had been transplanted from medieval Europe, all weathered stone and stained glass that gleamed dully in the streetlights. The red door stood slightly ajar, spilling warm yellow light onto the steps. Sarah approached carefully, every instinct screaming that this was a mistake. The neighborhood was silent at this hour, row houses with darkened windows, parked cars sleeping under street lamps, nothing moving except her shadow and the occasional drift of wind-scattered trash. She pushed through the red door into a small vestibule that smelled of incense and old wood. Beyond that, the main sanctuary, rows of wooden pews facing an altar adorned with brass and candlelight, vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows above. A single figure sat in the front pew, backlit by candles, waiting. "Close the door, Ms. Mitchell." The same gravelly voice from the phone. "We don't have much time." Sarah closed the door and walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing off stone. As she got closer, she could make out details. A man in his late 60s wearing a rumpled suit that had been expensive once, face lined with decades of stress and secrets, eyes that had seen too much and forgotten none of it. Gerald Hastings looked exactly like what he claimed to be. A career intelligence officer who'd spent his life in the shadows and carried those shadows with him into retirement. "You're putting yourself at considerable risk meeting me," Hastings said without preamble, as Sarah sat in the pew beside him. "They're tracking you. 3-person team, experienced, probably contractors rather than official agency personnel. They've been authorized to eliminate you if you don't drop the Reeves investigation." "How do you know this?" "Because I still have friends in the community. Friends who are disturbed by what happened to Daniel Reeves and what's happening to you. Friends who believe that burning good officers to protect bureaucratic mistakes is morally reprehensible." Hastings pulled a thumb drive from his pocket and held it up between them. "This contains everything you need to understand what really happened 3 years ago. Operational files, classified memos, communications between agency leadership discussing how to handle the Reeves problem. It's all there." Sarah reached for the drive, but Hastings pulled it back. "Before I give this to you, you need to understand what you're getting into. The operation that Daniel Reeves was running, codename Blacklight, was designed to penetrate a Chinese intelligence network that had successfully stolen cyber weapons from the NSA. These weren't just hacking tools, Ms. Mitchell. These were weapons capable of shutting down power grids, disabling financial systems, compromising military communications. In the wrong hands, they could cripple entire nations. And Reeves was supposed to stop the sale? Reeves was supposed to infiltrate the network, identify all the players, and eliminate them before the weapons changed hands. He spent 6 years building his cover, becoming someone the Chinese trusted, getting close enough to the operation to destroy it from within. Hastings' voice carried a mixture of admiration and sadness. Daniel Reeves was one of the best field officers I ever worked with. Brilliant, dedicated, capable of extraordinary things. But Blacklight was compromised from the start. The memo I found mentioned an internal leak. Hastings nodded slowly. There's a mole in the agency. Someone high enough to access operational details. Someone who's been feeding information to Chinese intelligence for at least a decade. We still don't know who. But they knew about Blacklight, and they warned their Chinese counterparts that Reeves was coming. The warehouse was supposed to be the final transaction. The weapons in exchange for $50 million. Reeves was supposed to neutralize everyone there and recover the weapons, but the buyers never showed up. No, they were warned. The 4 men Reeves killed were the sellers, all American intelligence assets who'd gone rogue, selling classified weapons to foreign powers. Reeves eliminated them as planned, but the weapons and the buyers had already disappeared. The mission was a complete failure. And worse, Reeves was now exposed, his cover blown, his usefulness ended. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. So they decided to burn him, make him look like a criminal, discredit anything he might say about the operation. It was elegant, really. Hastings' voice dripped with bitterness. Arrange for his arrest at the scene. Ensure the evidence was ironclad, rush him through trial before anyone could ask difficult questions, put him on death row where he'd be isolated, and his credibility destroyed. If he ever tried to talk, he'd just be another convicted killer making wild claims. And if he stayed silent, which they correctly predicted he would, he'd simply be executed, and the whole embarrassing episode would be buried with him. Who ordered it? Who made the decision to sacrifice Reeves? Hastings was silent for a long moment, staring at the altar as if seeking divine guidance. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. That's the question that haunts everyone who knows the truth. The order came from someone with significant authority, someone who could orchestrate evidence, manipulate a trial, and arrange for a death sentence. We have theories. We have suspicions, but we don't have proof. He handed Sarah the thumb drive. This contains enough evidence to reopen Reeves's case, to raise serious questions about his conviction, maybe even enough to stay his execution. But using it will put a target on your back permanently. The people who burned Reeves won't hesitate to burn you. Are you prepared for that? Sarah closed her fingers around the drive, feeling its weight. A few grams of plastic and silicon that contained the power to destroy careers and possibly save a life. Daniel Reeves told me I reminded him of someone who died asking the right questions. Who was she? Hastings' expression shifted, pain flickering across his weathered features. Catherine Blake. CIA analyst, brilliant mind, absolute integrity. She was part of the team running Blacklight, one of the few people who knew Reeves's true identity. When the operation went wrong and Reeves was arrested, Catherine started asking questions. She couldn't understand why the agency wasn't intervening, why they were allowing one of their own officers to be convicted of murder. She pushed too hard, too publicly. She drowned in her bathtub 3 weeks before Reeves' trial concluded. Jesus. The official ruling was accidental death. She'd been drinking, slipped, hit her head. Hastings' voice hardened. Catherine Blake had been sober for 12 years. She wouldn't have been drinking, and she was a competitive swimmer in college. The idea that she drowned in 6 inches of water is absurd, but the investigation was cursory. The case closed quickly, and anyone who suggested foul play was politely but firmly told to drop it. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold church. And you think the same people who killed her are tracking me now? I don't think it, Ms. Mitchell, I know it. Which is why you need to decide right now whether you're willing to risk everything for the truth. Because once you use what's on that drive, there's no going back. You'll be in their crosshairs until either you expose them or they eliminate you. Sarah thought of Daniel Reeves sitting calmly in that interview room, accepting his fate with disturbing equanimity. She thought of Walter Green shuffling through the prison corridors, an innocent old man waiting to die for a crime he didn't commit. She thought of Catherine Blake drowning in her bathtub, murdered for asking questions that threatened powerful people. I'm in, she said quietly, whatever it takes. Hastings studied her face, then nodded slowly. Then let me give you some practical advice. First, don't go home. Don't go to your office. Don't contact anyone through official channels. Assume every communication is monitored. Second, you need allies, journalists, lawyers, people outside the intelligence community who can help amplify the truth once you're ready to go public. Third, you need insurance. Copies of everything, stored in multiple locations, with dead man switches that trigger if anything happens to you. And fourth, you need to get Daniel Reeves to talk. Everything on that drive is classified. None of it can be used in court without someone with direct knowledge testifying to its authenticity. Reeves has maintained his silence for 3 years, but he's the only person who can definitively confirm what really happened in that warehouse. Without his testimony, all you have is hearsay and classified documents that will be dismissed as forgeries. Sarah shook her head. He won't talk. He told me himself that he deserves the death sentence, that justice is being served. That's survivor's guilt talking. Reeves lost his entire team. Good officers who trusted him, who followed his lead into an operation that was doomed from the start. He blames himself for their deaths. He thinks accepting execution is somehow atonement. Hastings leaned forward, his voice urgent. But Daniel Reeves is also a professional. If you can convince him that staying silent means Catherine Blake died for nothing, that it means the mole continues operating and more officers will be compromised, he might change his mind. That's a lot of maybes. It's all we have. The truth about Blacklight is buried under layers of classification and corruption. The only way to bring it to light is to force it into the open, to create enough noise that they can't silence everyone involved. You make that happen, and you might just save Reeves's life. You fail, and you'll both end up dead. Hastings stood, his movements slow and careful, the weight of his years evident in every gesture. I need to go. I've been here too long already. My phone will ring soon. My wife, checking on me, except it won't really be my wife. It'll be someone reminding me that retired officers who talk too much sometimes have accidents. He placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, the gesture almost paternal. Be careful, Ms. Mitchell. Be smart. And remember, the people you're fighting have unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Your only advantages are speed, surprise, and righteous anger. Use them well. He walked toward a side door near the altar, disappearing into shadows without looking back. Sarah sat alone in the empty church, clutching the thumb drive, feeling the weight of what she'd taken on settling across her shoulders like a physical burden. She stayed there for 10 minutes, making sure Hastings wasn't followed, giving herself time to think through her next moves. Then she slipped out through the red door into the pre-dawn darkness, moving quickly toward where she'd parked her car. The Camry was exactly as she'd left it, unremarkable, anonymous, waiting under a street lamp. Sarah unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and was reaching for the ignition when she noticed something wrong. The glove compartment was open. Her phones were gone. So was her gun. Her hand froze on the key as understanding flooded through her nervous system like ice water. They'd found her car while she was in the church. They'd taken her phones to track her communications, taken her weapon to make her vulnerable. They were sending a message. We know where you are. We know what you're doing. We can reach you whenever we want. Sarah's breath came faster, panic threatening to overwhelm training and experience. She forced herself to think, to move past fear into action. They had her phones, which meant they could track her through GPS and cell towers. They knew what she was driving. They probably had her credit card information, her hotel records, her entire digital footprint mapped and monitored. She needed to disappear. Really disappear. The kind of disappearing that required cash, false identities, and help from people who operated outside official systems. Sarah started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, checking her mirrors obsessively, looking for the tail she knew was there. 3 blocks later, she spotted it, a dark SUV maintaining careful distance, professional enough to stay back but close enough that she couldn't lose them easily. Her mind raced through options. She could try to lose them in city traffic, but they probably had multiple vehicles and could coordinate. She could drive to a police station, but that would force her to explain what she was doing. And she couldn't trust that local police weren't compromised. She could abandon the car and run, but on foot in an unfamiliar city at 4 a.m, she'd be even more vulnerable. Sarah knows she must get to a public area with cameras so her pursuers can't eliminate her without consequences. She copies sensitive intelligence files onto her car's system, then heads into downtown Philadelphia while being tailed. Her burner phone rings, a clear sign her enemies have already compromised her communications. She ignores it and drives toward safety, the incriminating thumb drive still in her pocket. Meanwhile, at Coldwater State Penitentiary, Daniel Reeves is pulled from his morning routine by the warden, who informs him Sarah is missing and likely abducted. Daniel demands an untraceable call, not for himself but to save her. Despite regulations, Holloway agrees. The cryptic conversation Daniel has suggests connections to dangerous people who owe him favors. Daniel then instructs Holloway to contact Judge Patricia Morrison, signaling his willingness to finally testify about the classified Operation Blacklight. His silence, once meant to protect others, is now costing lives. Back in Philadelphia, Sarah abandons her vehicle and escapes on foot, sending the classified files to an investigative journalist as a failsafe. Just as her pursuers close in, a mysterious operative claiming to be sent by Daniel rescues her, confirming his knowledge with words only Daniel could have passed on. Trusting him, she follows as they evade the chase and escape by car. At the prison, federal marshals arrive. Daniel is dressed for court and escorted out. A prisoner turned critical witness, his decision signals the reawakening of buried secrets. Operation Blacklight is coming to light, and once exposed, nothing about their world will remain the same.